Hey, this is Kayla interrupting before the start of the podcast to say that this special episode was a live show filmed at Norwich Games Con on the 24th of August. That means you might occasionally hear some sounds of sort of background noise or people entering to the show late. Don't worry about that, I've done my best to minimize it. Additionally, this episode ends with some questions from the live audience we had. Speaking of conventions, I'll be attending Tabletop Scotland this weekend from the 3rd to the 5th of September. Then I'll be at Dragon Meet in November, and I'll also be at Tags Festival in December. I don't have any live shows scheduled for any of those events currently, but if anything does come together, I will definitely be keeping you posted on my social media. So do be sure to go to socials.ratwave.uk and find where you can follow me on your platform of choice. With this over, please enjoy the episode. I'm Kayla Dice, and this is Your Life Path. I'm an out-of-control tabletop role-playing game designer, and on this show I talk to TTRPG designers and other exciting guests about everything that inspires or influences them away from role-playing. Today I'm really excited to welcome the creator of Vaults of Vaarn to the show, Leo Hunt.
Hey, what's up everybody? Hi, nice to meet you all.
Would you be able to introduce yourself more to our audience and say a bit about Vaults of Vaarn?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an author, an illustrator, and I also make the kind of science fantasy tabletop RPG Vaults of Vaarn, which is kind of been published in sort of periodical zine form since 2020, mostly via my website.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into like the sort of periodical nature of the project, because I find that really interesting and really unique compared to so many other things. Usually with the podcast, I like to start off with some sort of biographical questions, get to know a bit about like where Leo's come from and how that might have informed their work. So a useful starting question to ask is like, where did you grow up?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Northumberland, a little village called Rothbury, which is, I think, most famous for being the hiding place of Raoul Moat, the guy who shotgunned the police officer and then was the subject of the largest manhunt in UK history.
Yeah,
and then
Gaza was there.
Yeah, and then he shot himself where I used to smoke cigarettes as a teenager. So
that is fascinating.
Yeah, I could honestly do a whole podcast about Raoul Moat, but I think we'll move on.
How long were you living in Northumberland for?
Pretty much since I was like 3 or 4. We lived in various places before then, but I don't remember them, so that's home.
Nice, yeah. What kind of influence, like what is Northumberland like as a place to grow up beyond like, obviously not very famous other than this shocking incident?
The one exciting thing that ever happened to us.
Yeah.
I got on TV and everything. No, it was, I mean, it's very rural, it's very isolated. There's a kind of undercurrent of like pagan sort of weirdness, I think. Like there's lots of like really, really old standing stones and like kind of, you know, vaguely sacrificial looking altars that you can find in the woods near where I live. So I think that really influenced my first novel, which I'm not, which it was kind of more about like ghosts and stuff like that, but it hasn't come into Vaughan quite as much. But
that makes sense, yeah. But do you think maybe there's some attraction to locations which foster a sense of isolation?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a very atmospheric place to grow up. I think you only see like your childhood home in a way. You only see it properly if you move away and come back after a while, and like it's really beautiful. It's really like isolated and kind of weird, and I think definitely if you, like me, if you're kind of an imaginative introvert, I was kind of always destined to go to these kind of fantasy worlds because like there weren't that many other kids around, you know? So
yeah, I think how much there are other children in a place can have a massive impact in a way that's kind of, I think, under-recognized because of, I guess, sort of schools or things. Do you have a memory of what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Yeah, I usually tell people I wanted to be like an alligator, but I can't hold my breath for very long, so it's kind of difficult. Yeah, no, the actual answer is I always wanted to be an author, wanted to be a writer, and I did have a career as a YA, like fiction writer for a few years, and I was kind of faced with what might sound like a strange problem to have, but like when you really want something and then you get it and then you're like, well, I don't know what to do now. So I just always wanted to. I want a book published. I want a book published. It happened, and then I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Like, I guess I write some more, and then I got kind of burned out on doing that, and I needed something else to do creatively, but I wasn't sure what. So, like,
yeah,
that kind of led me here, I think.
That makes, yeah, I think. How do you feel like the relationship, I guess, between how you've approached novel writing and RPGs is? Because I think it's interesting because so much RPG work is in setting, which is a very important thing in novels, but not necessarily always like the main focus.
Yeah, sure. So there's a kind of truism about GMs, which is they're like kind of frustrated novelist, right? Which I was a frustrated novelist, but in a different way, because I'd written novels and I was kind of like, I'm done with this for the moment. So I was kind of really, if I can attribute my modest success to anything, it's that I really tried to run as hard as I could in the opposite direction. So when I finally found like, oh God, I don't have to make a plot. I don't have to like, do this whole intricate timeline of what happened before you got to this point. I found I really liked that. Plotting was my least favorite part of writing like a traditional novel. And, I think tabletop RPG writing I've found is kind of almost like the anti-plot in a way, or it's a way of like presenting it in a very different, like non-linear kind of like sense that really appealed to me.
Yeah, I feel it's kind of I sometimes think of like very good, well-written locations, and I did definitely think about this while reading like Gnosis in issue 2 of Vaarn, the city. Is I feel like there's so often like a still frame of a situation that is in motion.
Yeah, sure. I think that's like what you want is a location that's the equivalent of like a guy balancing a giant like plate of eggs and he's about to trip over a dog, like, and they're just frozen like that, like some kind of old style like comedy thing. But like, as a political situation, you want this. It's just before disaster, but like whatever the players do is gonna like have an impact. Like they can try and catch some of the eggs, or they can kick the guy harder, or like as usually is what happens with my players. But yeah, it's a different way of presenting like setting and like story, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. It almost has, I guess, like the way Renaissance paintings are often in motion. So did you move straight to writing after you finished school, or did you study first, or did you do any other jobs first?
I'm a sick man who's never had another job, but like no, I basically just when I went to university for creative writing, and I got an agent there and like kind of had my sort of YA career straight out of university, so I never got like a real job, which has probably affected me in ways that I don't like to think about. But,
I'm someone who's spent a lot of time unemployed. I've been a teacher, and then other professional pursuits I've done, like wrestling or comedian, have not been employment. So I've spent a lot of other time unemployed, which is... it's an interesting perspective, I guess. Where did you go to study?
I actually studied at University of East Anglia, which is like how I'm here. I still live in Norwich, where we are recording. So I'm one of the graduates who stayed, basically.
I'll probably read another intro, but if I forget to, I should mention we are recording this episode live in front of a crowd at Norwich Games Con, which is really exciting.
The crowd is almost double the amount of people on stage. So
which I'll throw it out there.
We love all of you.
As a stand-up comedian, I've been in rooms where that's not true. You occasionally you see a sketch group and it's 3 people, and I'm like, that's a bold decision to be a sketch group of 3 people, because it is so easy to outnumber an audience.
They need to qualify for carpooling, I guess.
But yeah, no. So did you find moving to Norwich from Northumberland like a big change, or was it something where it's because this is a city, but obviously it does have a lot of like nice country areas.
Yeah, it still has that like. I'd say it's like about as small of a city could be to be considered like a city. I think no, I really liked it. I was kind of done with where I grew up, so I was happy to go somewhere else. And it compared to where my parents live, it felt like really urban and like kind of whereas all of my friends had kind of moved here from my friends that I made at uni had moved here from London, and it felt quite small to them. So it's just perspective, I guess. Yeah,
I think so much about like where you end up is kind of informed by where you've come from in an interesting way. Like I think with issue, if I'm getting the numbers right, 4 of Vaarn, going to the wall is such a like defined setting. Maybe we'll talk about that in more detail later. That I could easily imagine someone just picking up issue 4 of Vaarn and going, oh cool, I get the wall. But I think understanding the wall when you've been in like the Great Expanse already, there's that similar sort of like, this is more shocking or more striking or more familiar sometimes because of where you're coming from.
Yeah, no, sure. It's an interesting thing about like how where you've come from always affects like the view of the kind of the place that you've moved to. One of my favorite books is Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which is like really influential on Vaarn. But one of it's basically, for those who haven't read it, it's like a book of kind of prose poems about imaginary cities that are all in some way also him writing about Venice, where he grew up. But one of my favorite cities is this one, which the name I can't remember, but it just talks about how the sailors approaching it from like the sea and the travelers approaching it from the desert see a different city, even though it's like the same place.
Yeah.
That kind of came into Vaarn later on, as we'll probably discuss. But yeah, I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I definitely think I've read Invisible Cities and really enjoyed it. And I do think there's something true in my own work where I'm like, every city I've written is a bit of London. It's wide enough city that it's sometimes very different parts, other times more specific. You know, the parts I hate and the parts I love get made into different settings sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, London really is the cosmopolis, isn't it? But it's not my home territory, so I don't think I've really written about it properly. I visit it.
No, so in a similar way, I'm aware, even when I've featured stuff not necessarily set in the UK, I'm like I'm technically writing a stand in American City, but this isn't about America because I don't know that. But I wanted to, switching tracks a bit, ask what was your first introduction to TTRPGs, if you remember.
Oh, I do. This one's kind of interesting. So my mum played D&D in the 80s, and she had in the attic what I now know is like the iconic like BX, like D&D, like the red booklet and the blue booklet. But I kind of I found it and I kind of read it, and I think this is one of the things funny about tabletop RPGs is because like I didn't get what it was. I was a bit too young. I didn't really understand. I knew it was a game, but I only knew board games, so I didn't really get what it was. So I kind of studied these booklets like obsessively, like trying to work out like how they worked, but I didn't. This was kind of before I could go online and like read about them. But because I wasn't like inducted by the actual experience of playing like with a GM or whatever, I just found them a bit baffling and kind of like almost forgot about them for like 10 years. And then I got back into like reading about tabletop stuff in the pandemic actually, and I found my way to like the good old OSR subreddit. Love you guys. And I found that everyone's like, oh, talking about these booklets my mum used to have, and like I finally kind of understood what they were, which is an interesting like full circle.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I think I got into RPGs like a few years before the pandemic, but I remember I got into creating properly, I guess, with that setting there. Did you ever end up playing any RPGs with your mum?
No, I mean, she was only ever a player, and she says she doesn't really remember enjoying it that much. So.
Fair, that makes sense.
But it's kind of weird that she has the books still. I don't know. I need to find them again.
Yeah, that would probably be very interesting. Has your mum ever read Vaarn?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, she likes it. I don't think she totally gets it, but that's fine. Like,
probably the counter experience of you reading through those booklets and going, I don't entirely get
pretty
these.
much. I'm like, here's this other completely baffling like pamphlet that
maybe that's
you have no context for.
Growing up is you're the one who ends up writing the booklets that baffle another person.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Bless them. They do support me though. They've got all of the Vaarn stuff on their shelf, which is lovely. But...
That's really sweet. I remember my mum. Actually, I think I've already talked about this on a podcast, so I won't repeat the story, but I gave my mum a copy of Terminal, one of the first big books I made, and she was very pleased with that. Similarly, I don't know if she's necessarily read through it. But I was wondering, do you remember, and I guess this may be, the reason I pose this is remember, because the answer can be so different, but do you remember when you first considered yourself a writer?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know, because, like, I think... I wrote a lot as a teenager, and I kind of eventually started to realize that like the amount that I wrote and like the kind of the seriousness with which I approached it was like kind of different to most people. In that like I wrote like I measured length in like pages back then because I didn't really know word count was like the traditional thing, but I wrote a book that was like 200 and something pages of A4, which I think was pretty decent when you're like 15, and then I was kind of like, oh, actually that's like quite a lot, you know, like I don't actually know anybody else who's written this much. And then I got to university, and I actually still didn't meet anybody who'd like written as much as I did in my teenage years, which I think is kind of like when I realized like, oh, maybe there is something here that like I am quite good at, or at least I'm dedicated to, because I don't know if you can. I think talent and like practice are actually two words for the same thing a lot of the time. Like, I think some people like said they thought I was like ahead of them at uni, but I was like, but you don't know how much I've like done before this point.
Yeah, it's not necessarily always like, oh, I've got this.
Hey,
shocking.
Sorry, this is my son.
Oh, hello.
Hey, Bubba.
Yeah, it's yeah, definitely this sort of it's very difficult to see the work other people put in, which I think sometimes, definitely in the TTRPG scene, can lead to a sort of, comparison as theft of joy or whatever. But now, relatedly, do you remember when you first considered yourself a designer?
Oh, as in game designer?
Yeah.
I still don't know if I do.
Interesting.
Like, people say that Vaarn's like a system as well, but I'm not actually that interested in like writing the rules, and I hate writing rules text, which is one of the reasons why I just used like Knave, which is Ben Milton's system, if people aren't familiar. But like I house ruled it a little bit, but I don't really consider myself a game designer particularly. I'm more interested in the writing and like art part of it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Because like obviously the first issue includes the rules. It's very sort of like, it focuses on them, but obviously like in terms of recaps going forward, it's always just like, oh, do this. But I think I do find interesting is individual little subsystems you write. Like, I can't remember which issue it is the one where there's a really interesting like way poison is work, or if you've been poisoned in something.
Oh yeah, the toxin dice.
Yes.
Yeah, I do. I guess I do it sometimes. I guess I'm saying I am a designer. I just prefer to say that I'm not, so people don't criticize me for it. But I think what I do is I make stuff like that if I can't find a rule already that like suits it.
Yeah,
basically.
So a designer out of necessity of your own play.
Yeah, essentially, I'm not one of these people who like is like, oh, let me tell you about my dice mechanics that I've figured out that are like totally different to everybody else's. I don't really care about that. Like,
yeah,
I do D20 roll high because that's what the players are interested in, and that's basically it. Like.
I find it really interesting hearing different sales pitches at conventions where we're at right now. Different pitches from different people on the same games, in terms of where they go for emphasis. And I vary it on other games even, but like I've been selling like Laurie O'Connell's Death game, and there I'll always mention, oh, there's a rotating GM, because I think that says something about like the experience of play you're going to get. Whereas I'll never mention, these are the dice you use. And
yeah, sure.
I don't entirely know where, like, what parts of design fall to where I'm like, no, this is an interesting experience versus it's just a fact. I want to start narrowing focus and really get to talking into Vaarn here. So Vaarn is a science fantasy setting, and you flag up in the body of like each of the zines itself the biggest influences as Dune, Hyperion, Book of the New Sun, and The Art of Mobius. And I wanted to ask about like sort of two linked questions. One being like how those works specifically informed Vaarn, beyond just like broad strokes, but like what was it you were taking from each? And I guess relatedly, I wanted to know more about the decision to like always be foregrounding that at the front of an issue.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, lot to say there. I think the foregrounding comes from like so. One thing that I think that is kind of strange about RPGs is that they're a bit of a kind of chimera like art form, and in some ways they really like seem to lean on like other media to like describe themselves. Like if you think of almost any popular thing, it's like it's always described in terms of like what movies or like books or whatever that it's going to be like, even if it isn't necessarily like that. So I guess in a way I just wanted to like lean into that and be like, this is kind of a mashup of these influences. If you like these things already, you'll find this very familiar for you. And I think I jokingly said, like, if you haven't read or seen these things, it'll seem original, but like it isn't. Because that's the other thing is like I think a lot of originality is just like you're not familiar with the influences of the person who made the thing. You know, there's such a long chain of like Book of the New Sun I read and I was really blown away by, but obviously it's a reaction to Jack Vance's stories, which I hadn't read, so I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean, going through them like really quickly, I think Dune is like really well known, so I won't dwell on it too much. It's just like it's one of those books that just you can critique it all you like, but it has the source. Like Herbert's number one, you know, the Sandworms are number one. I read that as a teenager and was just like really taken by the planet and the kind of weird ecology. So obviously, when I was going to make my own setting, I was going to be like, oh well, it's like Dune. It has like sandworms. That was like point one. Book of the New Sun is like the most like literary head, like lit head kind of like reference, I think. That's my favorite one, but it's like it's a pretty dense like kind of dying earth story about this like medieval world that's actually not medieval. It's like built on the ruins of like layer cakes of millions of years of like civilizations, which is very D&D and like really sort of appealed to me. Hyperion is like I think the one that's like least obvious when you read Vaarn actually, but some of the backstory with like the AIs is based on Hyperion, and then Mobius is more for the kind of visual side, but like his kind of like surrealistic, like colorful, very like elegant kind of like 20th century sort of images. I mean, obviously he's just the GOAT. Like you can't really have like science fiction and like fantasy art without his influence. I think if you look at his fingerprint on stuff like Alien, like you know, Blade Runner, all kinds of things, like everything you see and watch in the cinemas, like you can trace back to him in some way. I would argue him and Geiger, but
it's
anyway.
because like you specifically have cited him as an influence because you're aware of that, but also I feel like there are probably so many RPGs you could look for and you could go, the creators of this don't realize, but they're influenced by Mobius because they're influenced by things that are influenced by him.
Yeah, absolutely right. He casts this absolutely gigantic shadow on like sci-fi illustration. So yeah, I obviously want to shout out the GOAT in the introduction.
Yeah, you mentioned there about one of the books as a reaction to Vance, and I was thinking about how often inspiration isn't necessarily always being inspired by something isn't always uncritical. It's often can be. I was going to say like it can be in reaction to something, and I remember reading the description of the Far Nomads and thinking, oh, the thing I find really interesting here is how I feel a lot of the ways these are different from the Freemen who they have some resemblance to. Almost feels as a commentary on like, you know, aspects of how the Freemen are written.
That is deliberate. I love Dune. It's got the source, obviously. The Fremen, I don't think he could get away with writing how he did now, and that kind of I really didn't want to do that kind of like white man's like, you know, sort of appreciative tourism of what he sees as Islam being in that regard. Do you know what I mean? So I really, although obviously the Far are inspired by the Fremen, I didn't want to link them with like Islam, you know, and kind of have them, you know, as doing all the kind of like faux Islamic kind of stuff. That, you know, they dress similarly to some like Islamic kind of peoples, but that kind of comes from the shared like environment rather than like the kind of direct cultural like imitation, if you know what I mean. Like in a desert, you're gonna want the robes and stuff, but I really didn't want to set them up as like, oh yeah, these guys have the call to prayer, but it's not the Muslim one, you know. Like it's I hate that shit.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. It is a thing where it's like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have a place in the world, and the Far so much of their society is influenced by like, oh, here's the world they live in, and here's how their response to the world. So I found that really interesting. Each issue of Vaarn begins with like 9 solid facts. Like it, you know, will elaborate on like, oh, we take an anti-canon approach here. But it begins with these 9 solid facts. And I was wondering how you came to arriving at these as like, these are the important things I get across about this setting up front.
Yeah, good question. I think this kind of comes into my kind of whole philosophy where like, I was just kind of thinking, what do the players need to know to like interact with the fiction? Because if you tell them nothing, they're going to be confused. If you tell them too much, they're also still going to be confused or kind of bored or like, oh, I forgot what you said the name of like the creator god was. So what I tried to think of was like what's like actionable about the world that like you would really want to know to like partake in the fiction. So it's a bit like, here's the really big basics. It's like, it's a big blue desert. Okay, great, I can imagine that. It's like, oh well, who lives there? And it'd be like, okay, well, it's kind of like science fantasy. There's like mutants and there's animal people as well. You want to know that, right? Because you want to be like, oh, I can be like a Cobra Man, and I'd be like, yeah, you can. And then from there you go into a couple more kind of specifics about like the dying sun and stuff like that. And they add up to quite a weird picture, but each one is like quite simple, so it's hopefully a bit easier to remember. And then you go into I think the last two are a little bit about like the speculative like history and like what happened before you were there, but you're not given any like names or dates or anything. It's just like very vague kind of like vibes.
Yeah, it makes sense, and like they are so strong in that I do think they give you, especially like it makes sense at issue 1 where it's this sort of like, hey, these are the big strokes, these are things it's important to or useful to remember as a player. But I do feel like by, issues 2, 3, and 4, it's also like, well, it works almost like how, this is maybe going to sound like a stupid comparison, like so many of I feel like in the late 2010s, previously ons and opening credits got folded into one thing,
sure.
Where like all of the sort of CW shows began with, my name is Barry Allen, and I am it's the details to remember you're watching the show, and I feel like they almost work in a similar thing of like, hey, you like Vaarn? It's been maybe a bit since you read issue 1. Here's the stuff that gets you back up to speed, and you're like, oh, of course.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's because I know that not everyone thinks about this stuff as much as I do, which is like every single day. So I thought like, yeah, maybe it's been a couple of years and you can't really remember, but that little introduction thing on the inside flap, you can like kind of reorientate yourself and be like, what is he talking about? Like, that's the idea anyway.
Yeah, I know. Was that a similar thought process that led to like the very sort of quick section in the credits? I think it's like integrated credits where it's like this zine is making an assumption about who you are as an audience, saying like, we're assuming you have some knowledge here.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that it's not going to be anybody's first or second or probably even 10th tabletop RPG that they've read, because I'm nowhere near mass market enough for that. But I wanted to be just specific that like I'm not actually going to tell you how to play like a basic level, because I don't know, because it's really hard to do. Like going back to my thing with basic BX D&D, that was supposed to be the kid starter set, and I couldn't fucking understand it at all. Like yeah. I didn't get it. I think it doesn't quite live unless you're actually playing it, and like I didn't have anybody to show me how to play it, so like. Which a tangent, but I think that's why YouTube and like actual plays are so like strong, right? Because finally, I could have watched that and got it if I'd had one, right? Like,
yeah, there's a game of mine I've always thought I struggled to sell this game so much, and I'm always like, if I just did a nice looking actual play, my life would be so much easier, because the game gets really fun when you've played it for a couple minutes, but it can take a while to settle in. I think it's. A lot of people, I think there can be a real value to writing a how do you play thing, but I think a lot of people write those without understanding what would be useful about them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's just like, some things that are just tough to convey through like text as well. Like, just think of all those things of like, oh, here's how to draw like an owl or whatever, when you're a kid. And there's really annoying me because it's like, oh yeah, here's how you draw the owl, like do a circle, and then you make it an owl, and I'm like, but I don't know how to make the circle into an owl, and that's what I felt like
I wanted to know about.
That's what I need to know is like, I felt like I had the circle, but I didn't have the owl. So yeah, you can use that as the quote for the episode if you want.
And so like Vaults of Vaarn specifically is like a living project. Like there's the individual issues, they have their own focuses, there's the broad strokes introduction of 1, there's the focus on an individual city in 2, 3 focuses on a lot of travel procedures and introducing new archetypes you could be playing as, and then 4 takes us to the wall, another sort of like tight location which on the verge maybe of some sort of explosions. I just think it's so interesting because they build on each other. Often zines are, we hear of the Far Nomads, I believe, as far back as issue 1, even though they're only coming in as a character you could be come like issue 3. And I think it does rewards a sequential reading, which makes sense because I did the reading very sequentially. I guess I wanted to know here, like, what was the appeal of making a living project for you?
Yeah, great question. I think basically, for anyone listening, I would advise you not to do it this way because like it doesn't come from like any concrete plan I had at the beginning. The honest answer is like I didn't expect the first one to really be that successful, and it kind of was. So like I was like, oh man, I got to follow this up. But I think what I keep going back to is that like this project and the storytelling it's non-linear, it's kind of modular, and it's also kind of deliberately fragmented. So like I'm interested in like these worlds where like I'm not interested in lore that gets dumped on you from the start, but I am interested in worlds like Book of the New Sun or like the obviously the From Software games like Elden Ring, where like there is this huge mythology, but you have to discover it by like almost examining these broken pieces of something, and like it's like a pot that had a picture on, and you get some of the shards, and you're trying to work out like. So that's kind of like the sensation I was trying to create, where yeah, like you said, it just say the far nomads, and you're like, well, what are they? And it doesn't tell you, and then later on, from context and from eventually a bit of a fuller explanation, you get there. And the secret is they're probably not as interesting. You know, they're probably not that interesting if you just get told straight away. But because, like, you know, I had people being like, what are they? Like, what are they like? And I'm like, well, you'll find out. Or, like, what do you think they're like, you know? Like, and eventually I have more of an idea and you kind of get to them. But I think the thing I would say is it's a big project, but, like, I didn't set out to write this huge, like, 100,000 word, like, tome about Vaarn. It comes from the bits that I'm interested by, and that I think have got enough juice to have like maybe 48 pages on them, and it kind of comes out of that. And there's all kinds of things that I intend to circle back around to and like write a little more on later, but some of them I probably never will, and that's fine too, you know, like
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it has that like thing. But yeah, if you read them sequentially, that probably is how it's going to make the most sense, because there will be stuff that gets like explained later.
Yeah, I was wondering, like you were mentioning, like, oh, is there enough for something to get a 48 pages out of? Is that how you approach what goes into something being an issue versus? I guess I was thinking with like Pariahs of Vaarn, which is like this expanded bestiary, and the adventures of their own things. Is there a sense that like, no, for something to be a numbered issue of Vaults of Vaarn, it needs to, you know, have a certain amount of stuff or be a certain kind of thing? Or?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is one of those things. It's art, not science, and I can't really give advice on it. But you gotta, if you're gonna do this like professionally, you gotta kind of know what ideas have got the juice and which don't. So like, you know what I mean? Like you're looking at a load of oranges, you're like, I don't know which ones have got the juice in them. You gotta kind of like feel the ideas a little bit. This is a very weird metaphor, but I think the thing is, I have all kinds of ideas, but not all of them are gonna sustain like an extended like zine or like an issue of Vaults of Vaarn, like you said. So some of them are a blog post, or some of them are like a monster idea for Patreon, which is what ends up being collected in Pariahs when there's enough of them. But yeah, trying to for me, it's actually geographical a lot of the time. Like I know like the trading city's going to have enough stuff going on that I can justify an issue, or like the wall is like, that's a big enough bucket that there's all kinds of little things in there that like, you know, even maybe like the Harpy City and the wall could have been an issue probably, but like I want to finish this before I die, so like you got to cut stuff somewhere as well. But yeah, trying to work out which of your ideas have enough juice to like sustain a longer thing is just something you get better at with practice, I think. Like,
yeah, I also maybe I'm wrong, but I imagine some of it like can be informed by having like practiced in like different disciplines. I remember on the first episode of season 2, I was interviewing Gorman Geist, who is currently a student like studying creative writing and focusing on writing other ways. And she was telling me about like, oh yeah, sometimes I've just got to find like what an idea wants to be.
Yeah,
where it's like, oh yeah, this can work as a script, or this wants to be a comic, or this wants to be an RPG. And they reminded me there of just like, well, does this idea, is it the kind of thing that has enough that it wants to be in an issue, or is it designed to be smaller? Like, is it not necessarily design made, but like, yeah, it's art rather than science, as you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't give anyone a foolproof like method for it, but I think the thing is, maybe what I'd say is just like if you're thinking about something and it keeps like suggesting new things and like branching off, then you've probably got a rabbit that's worth chasing there. We're on rabbits, not oranges now. Keep up. If you kind of sit down 1 or 2 sessions and then of writing, and then you're like, I'm kind of done with this one. I can't really feel it like trying to get away from me. Then you probably don't have enough for like an extended thing.
Yeah, I've definitely written some ideas before where I was like, oh, I'll expand this with a bunch of stuff at the back of the book, and then I'm like, nah, doesn't want it, doesn't need it.
No, yeah, if you're trying to do CPR to it, then like it's just, maybe it's just a small idea, which are also fine. But yeah, recognizing what suits what is difficult.
Yeah, and this kind of links a bit, because I'm often really interested in how format shapes art, and I was thinking about the adventures, which often are not always, but like 3 of them, I think my numbers maybe offer like these specific 2-page spreads, and they're contained there, whereas others then have this small pamphlet size. I guess I was wondering, like, were you going into this going, okay, I'm writing an adventure, this is the space I've got to work with?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think again, like the format and also the restrictions of the format can be really helpful for creativity, because I don't know if you can tell from the zines, but I have a tendency towards the verbose, and I think one of the many things that's been good actually has been working in a small format as a really verbose writer. Like, it forces you to kind of like cut stuff down like a lot to fit, and I think that usually suits the tabletop RPG. Because you got to think these things are at least nominally they're references to be used at a game table while 3 other people are talking to you. So like the kind of like old style like wall of text like writing, I don't actually think is best suited for it. Although I quite like writing that way, so it's a kind of difficult balancing act. I think people are making good strides with like the more kind of instructional like like OSE kind of house style things, where it's at least trying to think of what somebody running this right now wants to like know about. But yeah, there's always a tension of like me wanting to describe something more or what have you. So yeah, a limited format is quite useful in that respect.
Yeah, I've definitely found that when I've done sort of 1 page or been like, I only have this many pages. But what you were saying there about like verbosity does link really well to the next question. Like, the starting of me going to ask was like, how consciously do you consider like the individual voice of Vaarn? I was thinking about like, it has so much strong evocative phrasing that like does get stuck in your head even without elaboration. And in my personal view, there's like a quite interesting shift, I think, when it moves from detailing the world to detailing the game. But yeah, is that something you give a lot of thought of to like, what is the voice of Vaarn? Or is it that the voice of Vaarn is your voice? And in that case, like, what kind of things have informed that?
I think so one of the driving things of Vaarn is like the voice there is that it's kind of drawing from some of those older like pulp writers who are often kind of self-educated guys who are maybe a little insecure about their education, so they want to show that they have the thesauruses and stuff, and also they're being paid by the word, so you get these absolutely insane like paragraphs, like Clark Ashton Smith or whatever I really love. And I'd been working for a while in like YA fiction where you do not get to write like that, because it's like commercial fiction. It's for teenagers. You can't write like Gene Wolfe or like Clark Ashton Smith. So I was like, well, I'm just doing this for me, so I'm gonna just do that. Except I was also aware, like I said, that there's these kind of space constraints. So I would write this very florid stuff, and then you got to cut it down and cut it down and cut it down to fit on the page, like physically. And I think that kind of inadvertently led to something like you said, where you kind of hone in on some of the stronger phrases and you cut some of the ones that aren't as good. I won't say it's not actually edited by anyone except me. So the other thing is it's just me doing whatever I want to do. So like when it changes, register a little bit, and like it can become. I think some people think I take it really seriously, like the setting, and I absolutely do not. It's supposed to be kind of like ridiculous, and it's both like homaging this kind of like pulp fantasy diction, and also kind of like it's meant to be funny. So there's a little wink kind of coming through sometimes.
Yeah, I think it has the confidence to know it can be funny, without feeling like it needs to like do too heavy a wink, do too heavy a, hey, come on, you're in on this too. I
Yeah,
think it
sure.
does have a confidence of like, yeah, we're playing really serious, but that's because this is the style.
Yeah,
and
for
you
sure.
know it's a bit, yeah, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely overact, but I think I also genuinely enjoy it. It's not like I'm not doing it just to be funny. I do like writing like that. I like that more like 19th century kind of like, never using a small word when a big one will do. It's kind of fun for me, and I'm the kind of person who like I go and like read websites about obscure words for fun. So like, if I read one, I want to use it in Vaarn basically. So that's part of it as well.
Yeah, I think I remember finding the way the bestiary entries of Pariahs of Vaarn were written compared to ones otherwise included in the core issues so interesting, because it kind of the large sort of explanations, they reminded me kind of like, I guess, sort of travelogues writing, or that 19th century writing of someone going into a place they don't know well and going like, well, I've got this all figured out.
So I mean, Pariahs is a great example where like you say compared to the bestiaries in the normal zines, which are really, really space compressed, that's kind of me doing the thing where, I can write more about this thing if I want to. And I could probably write like that about every single bestiary entry, but I don't think that would be the best use of my time, you know what I mean? But like, so there's a tension there, definitely, because people describe it as minimalist sometimes, and like, it is insanely not. It's not minimalist at all. Like, I think they just think that because of the space constraints occasionally.
Yeah. I think some people have the impulse of assuming tables means minimalism, which
is not true.
It's not true. Like both, obviously there's always more to a game than the table is inclusive. Also, I do not think of your tables as minimalist.
No.
I think they're like lots of options there. There's lots of focus. Like I don't think that the drugs table is minimalist. I think it's really asking you to consider a lot about.
It's baroque. It's actually asking a lot of you if you use it. Yes. It's not minimalist at all.
But I get the impulse there. So I'm going to go through some sort of broader process questions here. Do you have any relationship with live performance at all?
Do I have a relationship? Yeah, we're not talking anymore. No, I find this a really interesting one because like I'm not a big theatre person, but I do think it actually has a lot. There's a lot more link there with tabletop games as they're actually played than people seem to talk about. And I see lots of like game theory being talked about, but I never hear anybody talking about like, or very rarely read any kind of theatre theorists or like, people talking about like, theoretical works about theatre, even though I think you could make just as much an argument that these games are theatre performances that don't have an audience except the actors rather than like a game. But, probably people have said that before, but I haven't like found
I think it's somewhat under discussed. I think some of it is maybe also just I think probably like for the large amounts of the TTRPG scene that are America based, it's like what theatre there. I think, not necessarily saying theatre's super accessible in the UK, but it's definitely less accessible in America, is my understanding even. So maybe
for sure
that can inform it. But yeah, I think it is so interesting at comparison. Like in the same way you can make an argument of, is a game a piece of theatre? It's also like, is a screenplay similar enough to an RPG book in some ways? It's also like theatre is the route where we have players, meaning someone acting as a character.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot there. I've always thought it'd be funny as a one shot to just give people like I don't know, like give them the characters from like an Arthur Miller play or something, and then be like, okay, well now go. We're doing like we're doing D&D rules. Roll up your hit points, and like we're gonna like resolve all my sons, but like in a different way. I don't know. I'm gonna do it someday, but
that would be interesting. I'd be very curious about.
Or like an obvious one, like Hamlet, right? You could do Hamlet, like
I think it's I mean, also I guess when you think about like, I don't know, a game like Die, which is exploring the idea of like the character and the person who plays the character. It's also like a lot of stuff that is about theatre about theatre. It has a lot of similarities to games about games in that same way.
Yeah, but I will say at the same time, I don't actually go to many plays, and I know one of my best friends is like a really avid actor and theatre goer, and is probably like listening to this screaming right now, being like, talk about this, and like, I'm sorry, dude, I don't know your world, but
Like, I'm curiously, I'm like, though, if you look at like, say, the Fringe, or other comedian stuff, there's so many comedians I know. It's like, yep, I'm going up, I'm running a game that's a bit D&D-esque, but I've simplified the rules. I'll be doing that for like 30 days a year, for 30 days out of the year.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, I think like these people aren't necessarily in a TTRPG scene outside of that for performance.
Right,
So it's almost like an unmet strand.
It's almost like Convergent Evolution, where they figured out that like, oh, if I'm good at improv and I kind of structure it loosely around this game with an audience that participate, like, who knew you get something really fun like for the audience, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So you're the artist as well as the writer of Vaarn, and I
yeah.
should have maybe asked a bit more about that, because I guess I was wondering like how do those two processes interlink for you? Like, so much of the art for Vaarn is really gorgeous, but I also think sometimes like the way it's put together. I think of Parise, where we have like the assassin slab has this quite elegant description, and then like turn a page, see the image, and I'm like, oh, that's really funny.
That thing is,
that it is like
comedic,
this large arm, but it's there. I feel that's a humor that is really understanding like the relationship between visuals and words. And I guess, are you someone who's like, here's all the writing I've done, how am I matching it with the art, or are you like weaving in and out of those roles?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professional writer, like 100%. I don't know if I could call myself a professional artist. I'm not quite at that level, I don't think. So like the writing is what leads for sure, and then I illustrate like based on how close I can get to what I'm imagining. While like that gap's quite big sometimes, because it's like, you'll notice there's stuff like complicated buildings and things like that I tend to not draw, because I'm not very good at like the stuff in perspective or like crowd scenes or whatever, which is a little frustrating, because I love illustration and comic art and stuff, so I wish I was better at it. But no, it's fun. I like doing it myself. It makes it like kind of weirdly economically viable, because art is like the most expensive part of putting an RPG together. And am I the absolute best artist? No, but like I don't have to pay anyone else to do it, and I'm not changing that anytime soon. Like,
yeah, I've been getting a lot into like photography and photo manipulation to try and make my own works visually more economic.
Yeah, it's hard. People want the art. That's what they expect from these books, even though like you're actually not going to look at that stuff when you're playing. But whatever.
Yeah, I do think art such like does have a really valuable place in terms of like, I guess, selling an idea to people who aren't so visually minded. But yes, economically it can be really difficult. I'm really happy I got like loads of beautiful art in Terminal. I'm also like, just because of where I'm currently, I'm like, I'm probably not getting a big art game anytime soon again.
Yeah, no, it's hard particularly without Kickstarter, it's impossible. But
yeah,
anyway,
and it's like the upfrontness. But moving away from that, yeah, you mentioned comics. So is like, are comics a big influence on your art style? Do you feel?
Yeah, enormously. I mean, like Mobius, like I talked about, like Jamie Hewlett of Gorilla's fame, but like Tank Girl as well, a huge influence on my style. Trying to think who else I really love. I mean, I could go on all day about comics again, like stuff like Charles Burns or Daniel Clowes I really love as well. But I think for visual design, if you're looking at something with like kind of like art and text kind of in concert, like I look at comics quite a lot, definitely.
Yeah, I often think when I'm putting together a lot of layout, I'm thinking of like recap pages in comic books.
Yeah,
because they're the more text heavy part of a comic, but they are not always going for the same kind of way of presenting visual information that like a prose book would be. Like then I'm leaning down towards like two last questions I have, so we're going to be bouncing over to hopefully a bit of a Q&A if anyone does want to think of any questions they might be interested in. This one is a kind of a big net to catch anything interesting I might have missed out on, which is just, have you ever noticed subtler influences from other mediums, things that don't necessarily always
that's an interesting question. Like stuff that I'm influenced by that people aren't aware of. So this would be a great time to talk about my belief in Scientology and the works of Ron L. Hubbard, which are really important to me. No, I think there are sometimes like resonances that like surprise you. Someone like mentioned the game like Hyperlight Drifter to me, which I had played and forgotten about, and then I realized that like there's loads of like almost like one for one images in some of the Vaarn stuff that I hadn't realized were there. So it's kind of interesting. It makes sense, but I just forgotten about playing it. Anything really interesting? I don't know. There's a couple of references to like lesser known book series like Beyond the Deep Woods that I don't think anyone's ever picked up on because they were like middle grade books for UK children. I think a lot of the readers are American. So yeah, Beyond the Deep Woods or like the Spyglass and stuff like that by Philip Pullman. There's a few direct like call outs that I don't think anyone's mentioned to me. No, I think I mostly wear it on my sleeve, like what goes into it.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a great amount of fun to be had in wearing something on your sleeve, so I completely understand. The last question I'll ask before I'm going to bounce to some of our lovely audience is, it's a bigger sort of wrap-up one. It's, what do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from creating TTRPGs?
Oh, I think the biggest lesson, not to get all like, sitting on the back of my chair for the kids or whatever, is like just do it. Just like put something out, publish it, write it, like finish something that you're working on. And it doesn't have to be very big either. Like I only did like a zine because if I'd sat down to do like a big ass book like Wizards of the Coast put out, I never would have finished it. But I sat down to do a zine instead, and that was still really hard. But I put it out, and like people liked it, and I'm now being interviewed about this stupid thing I wrote like 4 years ago, like which is it's great. Like it's like you. I'm not saying that'll happen to you if you make your thing, but like it definitely won't happen if you don't make it. You know what I mean? Like that's what I'd say. Just like it taught me to just kind of dive into like DIY stuff and like put out what you're interested in. Don't try and work out if other people will be. Just like do your best, and like you can learn from it, and like maybe you'll meet other people who like the same thing. And I've been really lucky that I have. So that's what I learned. Like,
yeah, I think just getting started is so important. I also think knowing how to finish something even when it's not necessarily like the form you'd put it into if you had 10 years.
Yeah, it's also very difficult. An underrated skill.
It's a day. I know friends where I'm like, you write as much as me.
So why don't you? Yeah, why don't you have anything to show for it?
Sounds like
sorry to be mean, but like
yeah, but I'm like, you do enough
heart,
writing, and you could, if you developed the skill to finish.
Yeah, if you just
you'd
keep
feel
it on your
so
hard
much
drive,
more satisfied with yourself.
No one's going to see that. Like, yeah, finish something and put it out there. That's the lesson. Finish something, put it out.
So, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask at this moment in time? Yes, over there. So that question there was that Leo talked about their experience in YA and asking, have they ever felt tempted to take Vaarn into other mediums?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I did toy with the idea of a novel, but like I felt like some of the stuff that I wanted to get away from and that I was really enjoying in writing the tabletop stuff, like I said about the tyranny of plot and like having to make it all make sense like internally rather than like presented as these kind of fragments that like I kind of write or discard as I like. I decided not to do it because I thought it would take away what I think is interesting about the project. However, I am very interested in like narrative video games, and like again, I'm not saying there'll ever be some like big thing because as we've learned, like if you set yourself a huge big project, you might not finish it. But I'd like to do some kind of like text-based thing or like something a bit more like Road Warden or whatever, like in Vaarn. I think that'd be quite fun. But I'm not saying that'll ever happen. That would be the direction I took it. Is interactive fiction where I can get the computer to do the boring bits of running the game and like focus on the characters, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that question. Does anyone else have any? Yes, over here. So that was a question of when playing the game, how much are you expecting the players to be engaging with like narrative versus mechanical elements?
Pretty much. Cool. I mean, thanks. That's a really interesting question and like quite a. I mean, I think that gets to some of the challenge of writing in this space, to be honest. So for me, when I'm actually playing, my rule is that I don't expect the players to remember the mechanics at all because like maybe it's just who I play with, but I found that like if I didn't play like a very, very simple system, we wouldn't get the game part right at all. So I just say like, hey, like you've got your stats on your paper, roll the 20-sided dice and tell me what you get. That's about the extent of their like rules knowledge, their rules engagement a lot of the time, which I want to say is fine. I'm not like, I'm maybe doing them a little dirty. Sorry guys, but I deliberately didn't choose a really complicated system because like I wouldn't remember it either. But like, yeah, I mean when I'm writing, you're kind of writing for GMs. Let's be honest. Like I think often players aren't reading these things all the way through. So like, I think what I owe them basically is as concise and easy to remember mechanics as possible, and then content and like story stuff that is better than you could come up with yourself at the table, basically. And like, if I fulfill like half of those, I'm happy with it.
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question. It's quite a deep one, I think, but.
Yeah, for me, I often find myself thinking about the games I'm going to be running and what my limitations are as someone who runs games. And then I'm writing for someone who would be running, who is like me. And the interesting thing is, as a player, I have different limitations. I could really enjoy Crunchy System as a player if like it's in a scenario where someone goes, by the way, I'm expecting you to read your abilities on your sheet and you remember them because I don't know them. I could work with that as a player. Not running a game. I can't remember enough stuff, so I always have to meet an imaginary version of myself where they're at, which is like, yeah, I need stuff to be relatively simple. I need to be making handouts that include useful recaps. And yeah, I think if you do have an understanding of yourself as a player and yourself as a GM and the people you play with, I think that does boost your design work sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. No, I always imagine I'm like writing for like the tired, annoyed version of myself when I'm at the table. But yeah, no, thank you. That was a good question.
Yeah. Are there any questions over there? Or yes?
Oh, that was a good question.
So that was a question of returning to our oranges and juices metaphor before it shapeshifted into rabbits. Do you ever find an orange or something, an idea that does have loads of juice that would be exciting to write about, but you think might not be so useful to a DM or suitable for this medium?
Yeah, all the time. Again, knowing what to include and not is really tough, and like I'm sure I don't always get it right. I think my rule is like, if I can't imagine how the players will interact with this, then I tend to like let it slide. Which weirdly, maybe it says something about me. It's why there's not a ton of information about like kind of like the religions or like the the faiths of the kind of people, because my party kind of like, they usually want to know what people want like materially, but they're not very interested in like spiritual discussions. Even though I even have like a generator that like shows me what religion everyone they meet is, and like whether they're kind of like devout believers or don't really believe it or whatever. But my experience has been that doesn't get a ton of like actual use in play. So stuff like that would be a great example, or like really extensive backstories for characters, because you just don't know if they're going to kill them immediately or like whatever. So those would be examples of things that like I think are a little more on the fluff side, and if it's time to cut something, it's usually going to be that.
Yeah, I find it interesting sometimes if I do have the space, there are certain things, and this is very much only if I've got the space, it would absolutely be like, yeah, the fluff that's first to get cut off. But occasionally I'll include stuff where I'm like, well, this is for the reader, who is probably going to be the GM. I don't expect it to end up in anyone's game. It's just a nice little bonus to the reading experience.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, people also like just reading about imaginary worlds.
Yeah.
And, one nice thing is that TTRPG books, like, they let you do that in a little bit of a different way to a novel, where it can be more kind of piecemeal and episodic, and, like, you come at it from a different perspective. And, people buy these things for that as well. I like reading about people's settings if it's presented in a way that's interesting. Like, I enjoy it.
And some of it is the nature of this show, but some of it's just how I am. Anytime I buy an RPG book physically, I do read it. I don't actually own any physical RPGs I've not read, because I enjoy that, so then I have some awareness. Thank you so much to everyone who has come along. This has been a really interesting discussion for me. Thank you, Leo, for coming on.
No, thanks for having me, and thank you everybody in the audience.
I have been Kayla Dice. This has been The Life Path of Leo Hunt. Thank you and goodbye. Transgender Deathmatch Legend 2 is coming to back again soon. A card-based beat-em-up for 2 players. An anthology hyper-violent hex crawls. Find out more at deathmatch.ratwave.uk.
We ain't reading history books anymore, baby. We writing them.